And what are we getting out of this year besides hopefully another top three pick, possibly another number one pick? It is not out of the realm of possibility at this point. So just think about that. We'll be in a bright let me just other than that, let me just say this in a bright neon sign, caution, development in progress. And not just the development of the players, but the actual development of the offensive and defensive strategies of the future. Coach Pop talks about it all the time about not putting Wembanyama in a box or on a certain game plan, using a pre-existing formula for Wemby because there hasn't been a Wemby before. So that's very smart in my opinion. So this year, though, however, is possibly the next year. It provides the sample, the actual sample size, and the data that is needed, that they can really look at and mine in the offseason to build the set list, if you will, the set list of plays to run, the defensive matchups that we're going to look to target every single game, or even where and who to draft to maximize the needs that are still left unfulfilled. And we don't know what those needs are. We got to see the sample first. And so it's a very smart approach. So what this means for Wembanyama in year one is just freedom, ultimate freedom. No one's ever had a year one freedom. By that I mean next season, next off season. I think that's maybe when things will shift if they do. So then the question now becomes, how does this impact Wembanyama's growth potential? I think a popular narrative out there is that they're worried about Victor Wembanyama being in a losing situation, and another narrative is that top tier talent that gets inserted into a losing or tanking situation earlier on in their career can set the table for them in a negative way for the lifespan of their career. Like they just always have that losing mindset. And I just really don't believe in that at all. First off, because in this situation with Victor, it's because he's with the organization itself, right? The Spurs. The Spurs rely on a few things. They rely on integrity, success, and caring to build their organization. Especially when this organization, you have Tim Duncan, Tony and Manu, Sean Elliott, all these people that are still a part of the kind of day to day, week in, week out operations and kind of developmental process around Wembanyama. I'm pretty sure that they're guiding him through these tough times where as you put a player on the process 76ers, like we've heard Iggy and Evan Turner, Andre Iguodala, and them talk about how it was very bad culture. Like, it was just very, very shady and a very toxic environment. And that happens to teams and play really good. Unfortunately, that happens to really good players that get put on bad organizations, not just bad teams losing wise, but bad organizations, right? There's a difference. And so this scenario that we need to take a longer view of this scenario. And I kind of like to bring up the Denver conversation, the Denver Nugget conversation, because they are a team who I feel like are building off of the template that the Spurs have laid down. For many other organizations have done the same thing, right? They all try to do what the Spurs have done through the draft, through developing players. And some other teams they don't. They have their free agent market is very fruitful for them and all that, and they can build teams other ways. But if we take a look at the Denver Nuggets as a case study and Jokic in particularly, you know, they just squared off the other day, right? Jokic was drafted in 2014, and they didn't make the playoffs until 4 years later. Now, he wasn't a number one overall pick, but I think right off the bat, they knew he had that type of talent within the organization. So during these 4 years, during this time, that is when they went ahead and took shots at Murray in 2016, Kevin Porter Jr. in 2018. So like those are two of their main pieces that are on their roster currently on their championship roster, but they had many other picks along the way after Jokic and before they got into the playoffs until they got into the playoffs in 2016, 17, right? I believe. So they drafted guys like Monte Morris, Malik Beasley, Juan Hernan Gomez, Yusuf Nurkic, right? Who got dealt to Portland because they decided on giving Jokic that kind of guy, that responsibility. So it's not a guarantee every year that even when you have the guy you feel like is your cornerstone piece, that in the next few years you're going to get that guy, the next draft pick will be the one that's going to be a focal piece of your team moving forward. So the Spurs, kind of in the same kind of vein, and also like in the vein of OKC, have required all these draft assets, right? And so the Spurs have set themselves up over the next 4 to 6 years to have a lot of shots at getting another maybe two or three all NBA, all like all star, main focal piece cornerstones of their program moving forward to put this championship together, right? So that might take 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. You just really don't know. But I really feel confident about that window scope being around that 2 to 3, 4 more years from now. And I like in what the Spurs have done with that draft equity and organizational behavior. To follow in this kind of blueprint that Denver has kind of done and OKC has done over the past few years, rather than trying to accelerate the process and end up somewhere in the middle of the pack for a few different years because we didn't have our own pieces to build with, right? Or with assets to acquire talent like. And so Wimby, he cares a lot about winning. He hates losing. And I was watching that Alfarine Shangoon episode on the Podcast P show on YouTube the other day, and Shangoon said something really interesting in that episode. He talked about how European players have a hard time losing games, and losing is a big deal in other leagues around the world. And here in the NBA, it's just another grain of sand on the beach of an 82 game season, right? And you have to have a short term memory in order to not let it get to you and affect your play game after game after game when you're in those type of scenarios. And a lot of veteran players around Shangoon kind of kept telling him like, "Hey, it's all right, it's all right." But for him, it would eat at him, and that's because winning's a big deal. Because coaches, it's just a different ball game over there in other leagues. It's not such a high turnaround of season to season, and coaching and all. Coaches have a lot of power, and when coaches have a lot of power, like the wins become even more important, right? So I feel like Wimby is kind of going through something similar right now. He has to learn how to lose, and the whole team does. And this brings me to a quote that I'll never forget hearing from former NBA player and former NBA coach. I don't know if he's coaching right now. He was coaching with Toronto last year with Nick Nurse, but Earl Watson, who was also a part of the Austin Spurs coaching staff for a while before he became a head coach of the Phoenix Suns back in the day, was speaking on team. I got to hear him speak on team building, and something that he always tells his teams when he was the head coach of Phoenix, and I'm sure he still preaches it to this day, is that as a player, you have to not fall in love with winning, right? And he told us that, and that's something that I preach in my programs too, is that you cannot fall in love with winning, and you cannot like hate losing so much where it affects your passion and your motivation. And that's because winning is folly, right? It's not winning is it's not real. And that's not what you should fall in love with as an athlete if you're dedicating yourself to a sport or to anything really. Because he used a great example in saying, there was games where he felt that his team played their best. They did absolutely everything right. They executed. The effort was there. The attention to detail was there, and they still lose. Right? That happens all the time in sports. Those are great games. You're seeing great sporting events in those scenarios, but someone has to lose. So it happens. Does that mean that y'all didn't play well? Does that mean that it's not that there's nothing positive to take from the loss? No, absolutely not. And it's the same thing on the other hand with winning. If you've ever been a part of a successful team where you're blowing teams out all the time, I've luckily have been a part of that, where you don't have to play your best and you're still winning by 20 because the other team just they don't got it. They don't got it like that, or either if it's talent or coaching or whatever. You can play bad and still win. So should you feel good about yourself after that win, after a terrible performance? No. And that's why you don't fall in love with winning. And it's a great lesson to learn. And a lot of the questions that get asked after being told that is like, well, then coach, what do we fall in love with? And this is where Earl Watson hit it on the head. Earl Watson said, you don't fall in love with winning. You fall in love with playing the right way, because through the process, you got to understand that the whole journey of a season is a process, and there's many of ups and downs along the way. But if you fall in love with doing the little things right and and playing for your teammates, putting the effort in on defense, communicating, being effective communicators, being, coachable, all those things, taking the lessons from the losses, that is how you progress throughout a seasons of ups and downs, where even through the downswings, you've gotten better. Because you've understand. And even through some wins, that you feel, oh, we played pretty good or we won by 20, well, there's always still room for improvement. And that's the mindset that you have to have. It's a growth mindset, knowing that no matter what happens, you're in it for the journey and you're in it because you love to play and do things the right way. And I feel like that's what is going to be taught and to Wembanyama this season. And that's because he is such a competitor, and he's spoken on this multiple times that he loves winning. It's the favorite thing of his in life. And I feel like that needs to be brought down a little bit because this is the NBA. It's very, very, very hard to win. And if you're going to play 15 years in the NBA, hopefully you win two, four championships, five championships. That's like 10 years of not winning. You know what I mean? So, you got to keep going. Giannis had a great quote this past year on that as well. But I'm sure the Spurs are preaching this not only this season, but for the past few seasons for these guys that have been in the locker room and have had to endure these past few years. But especially for Wembanyama moving forward, I can really uh, hope that that's the kind of voice that's the messages that he's hearing, not just from coaches but former players and his teammates. So once he buys into the process, excuse me, then I think we're going to be just fine.